We just played Finspan. Yes, Finspan, the game that's had everybody talking,
Yes.
Good, bad, or otherwise, over the last
Made quite a
few
splash.
weeks. Oh boy, the puns have started. But yes, we have Finspan on the table, and Emily and I just played it, so we're going to tell you what we think. We're going to tell you a little bit about how we think it stacks up in the Span universe. And speaking of the Span universe, you know what? If you're watching this and you're not a fan of the Span universe, don't just watch this and hate watch it. You know, this is a great addition to the Span universe, and I personally, just to get this out there, I'm a fan of the Span.
You're a fan of the Span.
I'm a fan of the Span.
We're gonna give you a button that says it.
I think that's a shirt. I think that's a shirt in the making. Jamie Stegmeyer, you're welcome. No, I am a fan of all of these games, and for one reason or another, there's some people who aren't. But this is clearly not the biggest example of someone, utilizing a property and doing more games more than anyone else. Pandemic, Ticket to Ride. There's plenty of other games that have done this without much crying. And there's a lot of other games in the Stonemaier catalog that are wildly different. So get over it. If you're here to watch and learn about Finspan, welcome. We're going to tell you a little bit more about it.
So Finspan is really simplified, right? Because all you're going to do is you're taking 6 actions. There's not more actions. There's not less actions. You have just 6 divers. That's it every week. You're going to place them either out to play a fish. So you're exploring the ocean, playing a new fish, or you're playing them out to dive, and they're going to go down an entire column, activate anything that they can activate, and activate a bonus at the end. Those are the main 2 things we're doing here. And so in that way, you'll see it looks like the other Span games.
Yes.
Right? You have the 3 kind of columns or rows or spaces you're going down. You have different fish this time that are coming out. You're playing them onto your board for points and for resources, tags, and abilities. But again, this is much more simplified, I'd say, than the other 2 games.
It is much more simplified, but I will say this too. That doesn't mean it's sort of like just a dumbed down version of those games. And just to give you some perspective, after the original Wingspan, Wormspan finally came out, what was it, last year?
Yeah, I think so.
And it is a more complicated, but not wildly more complicated game. But it does some things that are uniquely different in that Emily already mentioned. Some games tighten the amount of turns you take, like the original Wingspan. Wormspan was doling out extra turns.
If you could manage it.
If you could manage it. And I always chase
way.
that for sure because it's really fun. This one, it's set. It's 6 turns. It's very straightforward, which makes this game, it's one of the things that makes this game more accessible and more approachable, because it's just one of those, it's one less thing that you're having to think about in terms of how the base game operates. And as we said, it operates in much the same way. You're either running sort of the rows or lines, columns in this case, or you're getting more fish out there.
The thing about paying for fish, too, that's simplified, is that what you're using to pay for fish is other fish cards. So in this game, your hand of cards is actually face up in front of you, and you can have quite a few, and you also have your own personal discard. So that's new and different from all the other ones. When you're playing a fish out, so say I wanted to play this fish, he's going to cost me 2 other fish cards and a young fish. So I would take these 2 active cards, put them in my discard so that I could play this guy out, and then I would
Could not be played there, by the way.
Though,
I'm going to be a stickler for the rules, but he'd be played up in the...
He could be played up. He could be played up here.
One of those areas.
And then one of my young fish too would have to be used as one of the cost. So the currency in this is just going to be other fish cards. Fish can create little eggs, which hatch into young fish. 3 young fish coming together is going to create a school of fish. And that's all we got. So you're really you're paying one of those kinds of resources. The other thing that they've taken that was like Wingspan was that you can eat smaller fish. So each of the fish have their different fin span. There you go. And they can eat anything that's smaller than that. Anything that they eat will be points at the end as well. So you're really just saying like, okay, I want to get more fish. I want to use more fish. I want to get more fish. I want to use more fish. And there's some cool things you can do about taking them out of your own discord.
Yeah, generally the concept of multi-use cards is what we're getting at here. While it's not just the cards that you're spending, that is a unique, interesting mechanic that's been in plenty of other games. But it's the first time it's really been added here, other than, like you said, the cavern cards in Wormspan. It's very innate. Most of the cards require spending other cards.
Yeah.
And then there's a cool mechanism that you can actually activate to actually get some of those cards back out of your discard pile and back into your hand.
Yes.
It's a really interesting, and it just makes things, while it's a little more, not a little more thinky, but it adds a layer of thinkiness in terms of like multi-use cards, like do I want to get rid of this? But you also have the safety net, no pun intended, of actually potentially going back in there. So you can always see some of those
discarded
choices.
Cards, yeah.
There's always one at the bottom of one of these columns that you can use, and there's plenty of other cards you can get into play too that let you go into your discard pile and get some of those cards back.
What I also think makes this more beginner friendly too is the fact that you're cycling through so many cards, and like in games like this where we have all these different cards, they're all unique, you're kind of like, oh shoot, this one looks so good, I don't know if I want to give him up. But because we're getting so many cards played, so many cards in your hand, so many cards in your discard, you kind of get to a point where you're like, I liked this one before, but you know what? Maybe a better one will come out. So I'm just going to put him in my discard for now and see if I can get some better things out here.
Yeah, and on those cards, you're going to see a number of different things. There's a lot of things that happen when you play the card. There's things that happen when you activate it, meaning when you go diving on it. There's also some end game scoring. These yellow boxes are end game scoring. There's a lot of really interesting things. Also, some player interaction stuff, you know.
Yes.
And this is kind of like, you've seen this in Wingspan, where you play this and this says, if activated, all players get to do a thing.
Yep.
So you've got a lot of that sort of thing going on, which is pretty familiar. One of the things that's not terribly familiar is all those eggs that then turn into young fish, that then turn into schools, require some movement around the board, which is really interesting. This last column here, when you dive, when you get down to here, there's a power, and then you can get down here and use this power. It should be noted, these bottom powers, they're used the first time you dive in that column and around,
that week,
but not around again. But when you move, you can take any fish or school of fish and start moving them around.
Yeah.
So if you were able to move a fish here, then once there's 3 fish there, they can become a school. The schools are going to be worth more points. There's cards. There's maybe some scoring things during certain weeks where you want to build towards schools to maximize your points. But it creates a really fun little game where you're like, okay, I've got to do this. I'm going to be able to flip some of my eggs. Then on the next turn, I'm going to do this so I can move some of those, consolidate to get some
And it's
schools.
like one of those little puzzles, you know, where you have all the little different shaped blocks and you're trying to like push them around because schools of fish cannot run into other schools of fish. So like at some point, so David has these 3 schools of fish in the middle of his. He's kind of made it a little difficult for himself.
I can move them this way, I can move them this way, but I couldn't move this one down for example.
So you're getting to this place where when you move things, you can move them as far as you want in that straight line. Although, again, schools can't move through schools. So it has that little twist there, but it's not like, okay, I have one movement, and now I have one movement, and now I have one movement.
Yeah, it's not little by little. You can actually make some pretty significant
big
moves.
leaps, yeah.
If you got a fish sort of at the cross section, you can move one over and one down.
And you're good to go.
And good to go. And that you could do, generally speaking, almost every time you run this column.
Yes, exactly.
And like we said, you're going to do this for 4 weeks. So this is very similar to the other Span games too.
Yes.
There's going to be, this is sort of the basic side where you have these scoring mechanisms, but they've got this side here and they have a bunch of tiles in the box where you can like basically randomly put stuff out here. So that's going to feel unique and different every time you play with different scoring. Then once you get to the 4th week, you're going to get some basic scoring. You get like a point for your eggs, a point for your young fish. Is it 6 points for the schools?
6 points for the schools. So
and of course, all the fish have points innate on them. And then some of those yellow things will either give you endgame scoring or, you know, like for this one let me put eggs on all of my sort of like predator type fish. So you're going to score that up. All of that's going to be feeling very familiar if you played Wingspan, if you played Wormspan. I would say that if you're a fan of the series, if you find that Wingspan is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think
but I don't think it's exactly the most gateway game.
No.
Like, you know, something like Cascadia. There's a lot of other games that are just easier to play than Wingspan.
I think you get to, sometimes you're playing Wingspan with folks who maybe aren't hobby gamers, and they get to their turn and they're like looking at these cards, looking at all these resources, and they're like, what can I do? What am I supposed to do? And this is going to be good for those. For sure, 100%. This will be anybody. Because really, again, you're just 2 options. You are playing a fish, or you are diving. That's all you're doing any turn. Play a fish diving. You don't have to worry about like how many berries do I have, how many leaves do I have, or different types of resources.
I mean, you do have to worry about where you're placing your fish, but even that is more straightforward, I think, than some of the other ones. The fish also have like icons on them so that you can put them up here in this middle row or down here. And then some of them are color coded so you can see here.
But not all of them, honestly. So I think there's
a
lot
lot
more...
of them can go anywhere,
exactly.
effectively. Well, anywhere
in their kind of section of the sea. So I think it gives you a lot more flexibility than the other games too. It's definitely not as tight, definitely not as like crunchy of like, ooh, I have this one, but it'd have to go here. A lot of the times you can find many places where you can put something. And the fact that you can also willingly have a larger fish eat a smaller fish.
Whenever you want.
When
you're playing a fish, you can do that. Now, some of them will benefit you if it eats something and it has fish under it, it's going to score a little bit better. So you want to try to do that. But yeah, it gives you that flexibility to where you're like, oh, you don't have to worry about like necessarily being out of spaces as long as you have a bigger fish. And speaking of fish, last thing, the board has 3 fish printed on it to begin with.
Yes.
Now, obviously, when you run your rows and things in Wingspan or Wormspan, you do get some things without having anything on there, but you always stop. In this game, you actually run the whole thing.
Yes.
And you're going to get a few things as long as you have 1 fish in any of these sections. And you'll always have in this first column, this 1 fish in this bottom section. So you'll always activate this. In this section, you'll always activate this. And in this section, you'll always activate this, even if you haven't played a fish card.
Exactly. But you could also, like I did, play fish cards on top of those as long as they're bigger, and the starting ones are very small, so almost everything can go on top of them.
And they give you no points.
So now these new fish are going to give you points, and they might have things like this one that says, when activated. So as I'm diving down, I'm going to get to do anything that I have fish in this section, and any of the ones where I have those brown, if activated. Very similar to like Wingspan.
Yeah, it brings up some interesting things for the more enthusiast gamer too, because while it's easy to play, even some of the times where I was deciding, okay, I have a fish that needs a fish under it to score some significant points. But you want to take a look at the fish under it to see whether or not you're covering up
more points,
some significant points, because you have to determine what you're going to net there. So you might want to get a fish out that's just 1 point or 2 points and then get that other fish on top of it. But searching for those fish can take some time sometimes. But I don't think, like you said, we're cycling through the cards so much. I never in this play felt like, I don't have...
No.
I need one of these fish for the bottom. Like you can run this, particularly midway through the game, and this is the column where you're effectively drawing cards. And you can get quite a few cards after a while.
Lots of cards.
I mean, you're at least going to get 1, 2, 3 more cards,
plus
if not more.
Plus a 4th one from your discard. Yes. So it's a lot of things happening. It also is using tags like you would in the other games, right? So where you have like the predator tag we talked about. I would say right now it's not doing a ton with the tags.
No,
so
probably
it's not
more soon.
I would guess more soon. Yeah. But because of that too, like it also feels, again, just very straightforward. Like we played this super quick.
Yeah.
And that was the first playthrough. I think it's going to, with these helpful player guides, I think it's going to be hit the table, you're playing it, you're done in like half an hour.
Yeah, and that's another thing, and this is nothing new for Stonemaier games. A lot of these games in this way anyway. The rule book is very few pages because it leans very heavily on kind of like using this player aid as a companion to the rule book, which I think is a smart thing. But it makes it even that much more accessible, I think, because you can very easily look at this, and it has all these icons listed.
Any icon you wanted to see.
But it also lists them as it relates to, as the cost for a card, here's what that means. And here's what it means if you're getting it as a benefit from the card. So it kind of like really spells everything out. So again, really accessible game. If you're wanting more from Wingspan or even more from Wormspan, this is not that game.
No, this is not more for sure. It is different, but I would say I would get this so that way I could play with anybody who comes over. Yes.
Anyone. Which I think a lot of us have said about Wormspan or Wingspan at times. This one, even more.
Yeah.
You can play this with anyone. If you've not seen this, the actor Mandy Patinkin, I think there's a famous video. He was Inigo Montoya from Princess Bride, by the way. But online, look it up. Someone's trying to teach him Wingspan and he's having trouble with it. I think Mandy Patinkin can even play this game.
For sure.
I'm going to leave you with that. And while you're sitting there scratching your head, like Emily's saying, who is Mandy Patinkin?
Who is?
Anyway, if you have any questions about this, if you're Mandy Patinkin and you're watching this video, please get down in the comments below. Let us know what you think. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.